This is a wood engraving from 1880, shows the Farmer Little foundry in New York with about 23 Bruce machines around the outside edges. This foundry, incidentally, was located not about half a block away from Bound and Company stationers down the South Street Seaport area. And this photograph from the 1890s shows 60 Bruce casters in the foundry of McKellar, Smiths, and Jordan of Philadelphia. The Bruce pivotal typecaster was not only much faster than hand casting, but it also made possible the casting of the ornamented types that started coming into favor in the 1830s, and which we now associate with the Victorian era. The elaborate designs and hairlines of the new faces have been very difficult to cast in the old hand molds. The typecasting machine, however, forcefully pumps the molten type metal into the mold as it expels air, eliminating bubbles in the type body and casting finely detailed types. Though I confess a liking for these types, I don't intend to defend their aesthetics here. They've been scorned by many printers and writers. Thomas Hansard in 1825, quote, "Oh, sacred shades of Moxon and Van Dyke, of Baskerville and Bedoni, what would ye have said of the typographic monstrosities here exhibited, which fashion in our age has produced," unquote. And Updike in 1922, quote, "A tide of bad taste had swept everything before it by 1844. But we should keep in mind that typefaces most characteristic of the Victorian era are display types. They were never intended for books, but for commerce. They originated about 1815 in the need for large, attention-getting faces for lottery handbills and posters. These gradually evolved into all kinds of commercial display types, and once fashion demanded them, nothing could stop the proliferation of ornamented types. William Savage, writing in England in 1822, refers to them as, quote, "giving a bold effect to particular words intended to strike the eye and attract the attention of the reader and the passenger in the streets," unquote. And that they did. Was this proliferation a bad thing? I don't think so. Others may disagree, but in any case, we can agree that these types are interesting and that they reflect the taste of the time which produced them. Helvetica, they are not. And at about the same time that the Bruce caster came along, a new method of producing matrices for casting type was invented. No longer was the difficult and painstaking work of engraving punches and counter punches in steel necessary, and then striking the punches into softer metal blanks. Now, in about 1845, it became possible to engrave letters in soft type metal. A model letter made this way was placed in a copper solution and an electric current applied. This deposited a shell of copper around it, which was then used as the basis of a matrix. This new method was developed by none other than Edwin Starr, now working in another large New York foundry, James Conner and Sons. It was ideal for producing the complicated ornamented types of the period, but it also meant that any foundry could easily replicate another foundry's type by simply buying a font of type and using it to produce a new matrix from which it could cast its own type. After the introduction of the typecasting machine and the electrotype matrices in the mid-1840s, the pirating of type designs blossomed. As David Bruce Jr., the inventor of the casting machine and a chronicler of 19th century American type making, wrote in 1858, quote, "An indiscriminate plundering took place, commencing among some of the minor foundries upon the older and more extensive establishments, the conscientious proprietors of which, after growling forth in vain their virtuous indignation at such dishonorable conduct, boldly threw off their coats, rolled up their sleeves, and made a wholesale appropriation of whatever was worth stealing in any direction from each other." Although the Bruce Foundry in New York, like every other, was equally involved in this copying, George Bruce himself found pleasure in the hard and sustained work of cutting punches. He preferred to take advantage of the new design patent law that took effect in 1842. In fact, the script type cut by him was awarded the first of these design patents. This is another script type by him issued a few years later. Patents were awarded for originality of design for periods of 14, 7, or 3.5 years. Typeface design patents make it possible to research the origins of many American type designs from 1842 until well past the end of the 19th century, at least until 1934 or perhaps later. Each patent lists the designer, the foundry to which the patent was assigned, the year, and the location. They are available online for searching. This is Italian black, designed and engraved by Julius Harriet of the Bruce Foundry in 1872. This is the patent paper. This is the specimen showing of the same type in the Bruce specimen of 1882, and a font of the actual type. I should mention that type design patents all show complete alphabets, figures, and points, and I believe are an untapped source of inspiration for type designers. Starting in the 1840s, we enter an era of expansion, industrialization, and commercialization. With these inventions, the typecasting machine and the electrotype matrix, the types that became the messengers of these movements also mirrored them. They were inventive rather than traditional, exuberant rather than constrained. They were not the quiet types of the 18th century's age of enlightenment. They shouted the news that fortunes would be made and lives to be bettered. Although mechanical inventions made possible the elaboration of typefaces, there was another important factor at work. The first lithograph was published in America in 1819, and by mid-century, this way of printing was in wide use. The lithograph could easily reproduce anything drawn on the stone. It thus escaped the limitations of typesetting. It was most widely used for illustration, but often reproduced lettering, which could be ornamented and placed in curved and diagonal lines on the page. Type founders, in an effort to compete with the freedom allowed by lithography, supplied the decorated type we have seen, and also the means for printers to set it in curves and diagonals. These special quadrants enable the compositor to set type in curves, ovals, and circles. From the earliest days, the type foundries supplied small trade cuts to be used as illustrations on invoices or in newspaper classified advertisements. They also supplied illustrations in the form of stock cuts, electrotyped from wood engravings, such as these and these almanac cuts. This 18-inch wide electrotyped and mortised eagle with type inserted in the mortised ribbons was used for many posters during the Civil War. From the mid-1830s, although the iron hand press was still in the workshops of most small printers, larger establishments were moving toward the more mechanized presses. Flatbed cylinder presses powered by muscle power, or more often by steam, were able to produce printed matter at high speed and in great quantities to keep up with the demand of an increasing and increasingly literate population. It was not unusual to see women at work in printing offices, setting type, feeding mechanized presses, and in an earlier slide we saw women finishing types in a foundry. That continued for the entire century. After the Cincinnati foundry opened in 1817, as populations and commercial activity increased in the West, foundries opened in St. Louis in 1840 and Chicago in 1855. This is a page from a New York City directory of 1848 showing a profusion of different typefaces. The page might almost be mistaken for a type specimen at the time. The page does show symmetry, neatness, and a certain restraint. These qualities would fade away as we move ahead in time. And here's a daguerreotype of a compositor, probably from the mid-1850s. By mid-century, many foundries were flourishing. The census of 1860 reported that there were 32 type foundries in the country, 6 in Massachusetts, 9 in New York, 12 in Pennsylvania, 3 in Ohio, and 1 each in Chicago and St. Louis. The type founding industry employed 795 men and 312 women. From small buildings and cramped quarters like this, the most successful type foundries now occupy large purpose-built factories and have many employees. The largest foundries were L. Johnson and Company of Philadelphia, started by Binney and Ronaldson, and about to become McKellar, Smith & Jordan. Charles T. White and Son of New York, successor to L.E. White. James Conner and Sons of New York, and the Bruce type foundry, shown here in a daguerreotype of about 1860. The Civil War brought a temporary halt to much of this activity, of course. But when the war ended, a business boom ensued and newspaper circulation increased dramatically. The first California type foundry opened in 1867. The oldest foundry, that of Binney and Ronaldson, had become the largest in the country, McKellar, Smith & Jordan. They issued this specimen book in 1868, their first year, and it weighs a full 13 pounds. The Golden Spike, signaling the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, was driven at the Promontory Summit in Utah in 1869. The following year, on May 24, 1870, over 130 passengers, mostly members and families of the Boston Board of Trade, boarded an 8-car Pullman train built under the orders of George M. Pullman, specifically for this trip. The luxury train included a salon with not one but 2 organs and a library for the benefit of the passengers. This was the first chartered excursion by rail from Atlantic to Pacific. It went from Boston to Oakland, California. On board was a quarto medium Gordon press, which printed 12 issues of the Transcontinental, a small newspaper with datelines that changed as the train headed westward. I should point out that the display type here is a wood engraving, which was sometimes used for letterpress printing where metal type could not do the job. In 1870, Oscar Harpel, a master printer in Cincinnati, published his typograph, a book of specimens. It was a sort of printer's manual with instructions and suggestions for the composition of books and advertising. The book was filled with samples of work that had passed through his shop, most of which was of outstanding quality. Harpel made use of all the materials furnished by type foundries, including straight and bent rules, typeset at angles and in curved lines, tint blocks, and gold and silver ink. In the decade that followed, his book was sold by type foundries across the country and had a great influence on printing, not only in the United States but abroad. Here we can see his influence directly in this page from the typograph, and this next one from the Boston Type Foundry specimen of 1876, 6 years later.